The New York Police Department, popularly known as the NYPD, is one of the most powerful police forces in the world. You don't mess with the NYPD. But on November of 1986, a 20-year-old boy would engage in a showdown gun battle with the NYPD, taking on over 20 police officers, shooting six of them, and making his way through all the police officers without even taking one bullet wound. This is how a young boy from a church going background, seemingly shy, humble, and well brought up, would end up becoming one of the most dangerous guys on the street with gang affiliation amidst rumors and claims of drug enforcement in the form of gangster killings, hits, assassinations, police dealings, internal police drug wranglings, amidst all other things thrown into the mix. And he would also escalate to become a force that would challenge the law and shake it to its roots. This is the story of a man some have deemed as a folk hero amidst the black society in the United States of America, whilst others have also doubted his integrity as the hero he is claimed to be. Today's true crime story is about none other than the man called Larry Davis. If you are ready for this ride, just buckle up and let's go. Now, to understand Larry Davis as a man and why he ended up the way he did, we need to go back to his roots and look at his genesis. Now, the early and personal life of Larry Davis was a bit controversial, or let me say a bit checkered. As an aspiring rapper, Davis was known by peers as musically talented. He played multiple instruments. He was also entrepreneurial, reputedly operating small music studios in the Bronx and Manhattan, whilst also repairing and modifying motorcycles, so he seemed like he was a man of many talents at the time. Davis's peers acknowledged that by midway through adolescence, Davis was dealing drugs, but claimed that he ceased once the woman expecting his first child miscarried, and then he learned of her crack use, which he blamed for her miscarriage. Davis had one child, a daughter called, well, I would want to omit her name from this, but she was born in 1986. So here is a man who was coming up, apparently as a man of many talents, and he somehow gets involved in dealing of drugs, and his girlfriend miscarries and he decides to stop dealing in drugs because apparently his girlfriend miscarried because of her drug use. This seems to be like a man who was going to find his way back to the right path and get his life back on track, but unfortunately that wasn't it. This would start a whole lot of issues with the police because there's a theory out there which actually Larry Davis himself resorted to, that he was dealing drugs for the police. Yes, he claimed he was dealing drugs for the police. So his problems with the police would start around this time. Now, Davis's arrest record, which began in early 1983, included a 1984 robbery conviction and subsequent probation violation, and by November of 1986, where he would have that popular shootout with the NYPD, a court hearing for it had been postponed 4 times. Now, soon after the successful manhunt of him, we'll get to that point, but soon after that, that charge was also brought in as one of the things that he was going to be looked to be prosecuted for. So Davis had a lot of problems with the police, and it is reported, or at least indicated by him in his feedback, that At the time, he was dealing drugs for the police and he had some money with him. This was money he was supposed to bring back as drug money to the police. But when he decided to stop dealing drugs after his girlfriend miscarried, he actually absconded with the money, and as such, the police started hunting him down. So this was what would eventually culminate into the showdown that we are going to get to. So it continues. Davis was therefore on the run and he was being hunted by the police. And in that case, you can't run from the law, literally, and the law was after him. And according to the police officers also, they were also looking to apprehend him as a person of interest in a crime, which also makes sense. But Larry Davis was also indicating that they were actually hunting him down under the guise of trying to apprehend him in relation to a crime he had committed. So it's just something else. Now, in early November, acting on a tip, police sought Davis but failed to find him at his sister's apartment within 1231 Fulton Avenue in Bronx's Morrisania section. So they returned to the apartment on November 19 when the infamous shootout would now occur. But I don't want to get into the shootouts now. We are going to get to it eventually. But Larry was just on the run, literally. He was just on the run and he was being hunted by the police. The police were resorting to all other things, mediums, avenues at their disposal to get him. And according to them, they just want to arrest him. But according to Larry, they were after him for their drug money. Eventually, on the evening of Wednesday, November 19th, 1986, acting on a tip, the NYPD team, made up of 27 police officers from the 41st Precinct and the Emergency Service Unit, that's the ESU, converged on the 6-story Fulton Avenue apartment building, where they had been informed that 2 of Davis's sisters had adjoining apartments on the ground floor. This was about 8:30 p.m. and just about that time, 15 officers surrounded the building and 12 others entered. 9 of those went to the 3-room apartment of Davis's sister called Regina Lewis, and of those 9 officers, 7 of them entered. Inside was Davis, his girlfriend, his sister, her husband, and 4 children. Lewis's 2 infant children were asleep in the bedroom at the rear of the apartment. Now, when she was interviewed the next day, Lewis's sister, Regina Lewis, reportedly said that once she answered a door knock, the police entered the living room with guns drawn, ordered all the adults to get the children out, and called, "Come out, Larry, you don't have a chance, we've got you surrounded." This, at trial, the police alleged that Davis had actually fired first. The jury believed the events presented by the defense, in which an officer entered the apartment with a shotgun and first fired at Davis while he was seated behind a desk holding his baby. So you see the two narratives playing out. Davis's sister indicating that the officers came in gun drawn, hunting her brother, and the officers also claiming that they came in and Davis fired first. So at this point, it's a bit difficult to determine who was actually in the right or who was telling the truth. And at that time, 1986, I believe forensics wasn't as advanced as it is now. So it would be a bit difficult to corroborate some of the things that these two opposite parties were pushing across as facts. Now, so that is how the whole thing was now being portrayed. 2 conflicting stories from a credible or seemingly credible NYPD and a criminal who is actually on the run. with cases pending. So, the jury believed the events presented by the defense, in which an officer, according to them, had entered the apartment with a shotgun and fired at Davis whilst he was seated at the desk holding his baby. And the officer had thought that he had hit Davis. And in that case, the officer was then shot in the neck, surprisingly, by Davis with a handgun. Now, you would go on to see later that it appeared Larry Davis, for a young man of 20 years, was a very good shot. Maybe more than the police officers, I don't know. Some also say he got lucky because he took down this police officer by shooting him in the neck. And the police then took cover. The rest of the officers took cover and they started returning fire as they retreated because they realized that this guy was not going to go down without a fight. And rightly so, if you ask me, because if you come to a man's house or place of residence with his family and you push him to the wall with his back against the wall, no matter who it is, I'm sure something would have to give. Either he backs down or he steps up. And in this case, Larry Davis really stepped up. I think much more than the police actually expected. The police took cover, they started returning fire, and in the confusion, no one kept track of Davis. In those confusion, Davis slipped into his other sister's apartment and escaped out of a back window. But he had guns with him, and through his escape, he ended up shooting 5 other police officers, bringing a total to 6 police officers that he put down in that gun battle. And guess what? He didn't even get 1 bullet wound on him. This is a bit surprising for a 20-year-old, given that he is not in a gunfight with some hoodlums or some gangsters. He's in a gunfight with the NYPD, one of the most sophisticated and world-class police units in the world. And he manages to put down 6 of their officers. Fortunately though, none of the police officers died, although some sustained very serious injuries. Now, after his escape, the police collected the shotgun that he had with him and the expended shells from the .45 caliber pistol that Davis took with him, a .32 caliber revolver, and .357 Magnum pistol were also left behind by Davis. Now, ballistic tests would later link the .32 caliber revolver to the Manhattan drug dealer killing. This is a case that Davis was being investigated for. So, although they didn't come there purposely for that, by virtue of things he left behind in the form of his weapons, it gave them that link to that crime. So, he was now going to be good for it. A police official said that all escape routes had been covered by officers, but none apparently saw Davis leave. He also said that the wounded officers were unable to return fire effectively due to the presence in the apartment of the 2 infants and other bystanders. That would also make sense. That is if that's what actually happened, but we have no way of knowing now. And Davis fired 4 shotgun rounds and 9 .45 caliber pistol shots. The police fired 4 shotgun rounds and 20 pistol shots. So I don't know. This sort of contradicts what they were saying. But neither Davis nor the 2 infants with him in the bedroom were wounded. He managed to escape through a neighbor's window. In the following year, 3 of the wounded officers accused the NYPD of negligent and reckless planning and execution of that particular raid, and blamed the Bronx detectives for creating chaos by bursting into the apartment before emergency service units officers could seal off escape routes. So, Davis had been in a shootout with the New York Police Department, the almighty NYPD, and he had come out victorious, not just with his life, but had also shot 6 of their officers in the process. and managed to escape from them. Over 27 police officers. This guy was now a legend, and most of the black community were hailing him as a folk hero because back then there was tension between the blacks and the police officers due to allegations of police brutality, amongst other things. So Larry Davis was already becoming a hero, but he was not out of the woods yet, because after that shootout and escape, a search was mounted for him. He was declared New York's most wanted. The 6 wounded officers were carried across the state to the Bronx, Lebanon hospital, and the manhunt for Larry Davis began. And it was a crazy manhunt. The police employed everything at their disposal. The surrounding area and the rest of the building were searched immediately. Police stakeouts were set up at terminals, bridges, and tunnels leading out of the city, and a nationwide alarm was issued. As the manhunt spread, raids were staged in Chicago, Albany, Newark, and other cities where Davis had relatives or friends. A man who said he was Davis called ABC TV at a point in time, expressing fears he would be beaten by police and stating he would not be taken alive. Acting on a tip that Davis had been entering his mother's home 4 days after the escape, police searched the building while interviewing Mary Davis. In a laundromat across the street, she suffered an apparent heart attack shortly thereafter. As she recuperated 3 days later, she urged her son to call the NAACP, who had offered to help arrange a safe surrender. So the matter was just escalated beyond, I'm sure, Larry's expectation even. His mom was already suffering a heart attack out of it. People who were concerned for him couldn't reach out because they were on the radar of the police as part of their manhunt for him. On the afternoon of December 5th, 1986, police received another tip that Davis had been seen entering the Bronx housing project where his sister Margaret lived. They surrounded the 14-story building, and this time you could tell they had learned from their earlier flop. So they closed off local streets and posted sharpshooters on nearby rooftops. Larry Davis was not meant to escape this time around. They left no stone unturned. The New York City Police Department was there in their full force. After searching his sister's second-floor apartment, police began a systematic canvass of all 312 units. They didn't find Larry in his sister's apartment, but they didn't know at the time that he was actually still in the building, but had commandeered another apartment and taken some hostages in there. At some point during the day, after Davis had forced his way at gunpoint into apartment 14EB, where Elroy and Sophia Siwa lived with their 2 daughters. Mr. Siwa arrived home at 8 p.m. and found his family and his neighbors being held hostage by Mr. Davis. So just like that, Larry had another thing to deal with. This is a man hiding from the law and hoping that he could just hide there quietly without any fracas that would alert the authorities of his presence in there. At 11:45 p.m., Davis released the 2 visitors and sent Mr. Siwa out to pick food from a nearby Chinese restaurant. You might think this is funny and odd, but hey, even people on the run have to eat. He also ordered Mr. Siwa to call Mr. Davis's mother's and sister's tapped telephones and give false location information. This was in an attempt to get the police to take the bait and leave in search of that false location. But unfortunately for Larry Davis, when Mr. Siwa returned with the food, he was stopped for questioning by the police, and at approximately 12:45 a.m., Mr. Siwa informed the police that his wife and two daughters were being held hostage by Larry Davis. The police had what they were looking for, and now sure of where exactly within the building Larry Davis was, they set up to get on him and apprehend him, hopefully without killing him. Police set up a command post in a nearby apartment, and by 1:30 a.m. had established telephone contact to Larry Davis. At one point, Davis threatened to kill the hostages with a hand grenade. At other points, he chatted with the negotiators about stereo equipment, asked about a lawyer, and showed concern for his own safety, saying that he was afraid police would harm him. For me, I think that Larry had settled into the situation he was in. He had come to the realization of what he was in, the reality of the situation, that he could either be killed, or if he's fortunate, he could consider surrendering safely without the police meting out a vendetta against him and taking his life because of what he did to 6 of their own. And you could tell he didn't trust the police not to open fire on him, even if he willingly surrendered. Throughout, negotiators repeated, "There is no use running. You have nowhere to hide now." And to assure Davis he would not be harmed, police showed him the press credentials of 3 reporters in a nearby apartment and allowed him to speak to his girlfriend. At about 7 a.m., Larry Davis, now convinced to an extent, laid down his .45 caliber pistol and surrendered. As he was taken from the building in handcuffs, residents leaned out of their windows, clapped, and chanted Davis's name. Exactly. So now his legacy as a folklore hero was cemented. He was seen as the black guy who took on the NYPD and won, giving the NYPD 6 casualties. But Davis was not out of the woods yet. The Bronx County District Attorney, along with the District Attorney in Manhattan and in Long Island, had many charges against Larry Davis. These charges included weapons possession, murder of drug dealers, attempted murder of police, kidnapping, and automobile theft. This came from an assertion that he had actually held someone at gunpoint to transport him from one location to the other when he was on the run from the police. So the charges were stacked up against Larry Davis, and the trials began. But despite 3 trials in 2 years, prosecutors were unable to convince a jury of that Larry Davis was guilty for any of the offenses against him except the weapons charge, the ones he used in shooting the police officers, until a jury convicted him and his brother, Eddie Davis, in the August 1986 killing of a drug dealer. Now, it still gets deeper. In March of 1988, Larry would get acquitted for one of the cases he was being tried for, which was about the killing of 4 Bronx drug dealers. The 4 killings occurred in October of 1986, and the prosecution contending that Davis was a crack dealer who specialized in the armored robbery of rival crack dealers, called over 50 witnesses. That's huge. You could see they were determined to get this guy locked up. And the 50 witnesses encompassed ballistic evidence as well and fingerprints on a cash box, placing Davis at the crime scene. But Davis's attorneys, William Counselor and Lynn Stewart, in their opening and closing arguments, contended that the prosecution's evidence was fabricated and it sought to frame Davis to excuse the infamous raid. So Everything against this guy is now like, oh, the police is just out to get him. They are trying to use their access to just frame this guy and put him behind bars. Larry's defense contended that Davis had been recruited and the police were now looking to get rid of him. But the police also contended Davis had been recruited, but they were not the ones who recruited him. He was actually into drug deals with serious drug officers. This was still not, they weren't buying it. Davis's defense were of the opinion, and they convinced the jury to an extent that the rogue police officers were the ones who recruited Larry, and they were now aiming to kill him in that raid. And the jury found conflicting testimony from the witnesses presented by the prosecution and discrepancies in times stated by prosecution witnesses. And after deliberating for 9 good days, which was at the time the longest jury deliberation period in Bronx history for a single defendant, Larry Davis was acquitted by the jury. So this guy did not just take on the NYPD and win in a gunfight and injure 6 of them. He actually beat a murder charge in court, for that matter, a black guy. So his fame as a folklore hero, mainly for the blacks, was still on the rise. It didn't end there. November 1988, there was another prosecution that was targeted at him for the shooting of 9 police officers, that famous raid that failed. And again, Larry was faced with numerous charges from the infamous shootout, where he shot 6 police officers. And here were the charges: 9 counts of attempted murder, 6 counts of aggravated assault, 8 counts of criminal weapons possession, and 2 counts of criminal firearm use. So you would see the whole thing was just stacked up against him. The odds were stacked up against Larry, one man fighting the law. But in this case, Larry ended up being convicted only on criminal weapons possession, and as such, he was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Now, this is how things had ended, but unfortunately for Larry Davis, he didn't make it out of prison eventually. He was serving his sentence out there at the Shawangkang Correctional Facility, and approximately 7 p.m. of February 20th, 2008, a correctional officer overseeing the block yard noticed that inmates were congregating around an argument between 2 inmates. When the officer went to break it up, he found Davis using his walking cane to fend off an inmate from attacking him with a 9-inch long metal shave. Davis was unsuccessful and was stabbed numerous times. The officer called for assistance, and the attacker was restrained and taken to the special housing unit to remain in segregated custody. Davis was taken to the facility infirmary, where first aid was rendered, but he had lost so much blood, lost consciousness, and eventually showed no vital signs. Unfortunately also, the infirmary did not have a trauma unit, and the supervising nurse called for an emergency transport by ambulance to a nearby hospital, but upon getting there, Davis was pronounced dead on arrival. Now, it still doesn't end there. Even in death, there are issues as far as Larry Davis and the law are concerned. After questioning by the state police and the New York State Department on Correctional Services Inspector General's office, another inmate called Luis Rosado, an alleged self-made crip from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, was charged with the murder. It is reported that when Larry Davis got killed, key people in the security apparatus of New York especially, and some of the other states who had had various encounters with Larry Davis were actually happy about it. To the point, it's reported one person actually said that the prison system has done what the justice system failed to do. I'm not going to judge that statement, but I think that no matter what it is, you can think it at the worst situation, but saying it is just below the bar. To date, Larry Davis is seen by some people as a folklore hero, while some people also see him to be something negative and opposite to that. If you've heard of Larry Davis, let's know what you think about him. Subscribe to the channel, please, if you are yet to do so. For our returning subscribers, we thank you. New viewers, we thank you too for sticking with the video to this point, but kindly hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, turn on post notifications, watch our other videos, and give us feedback on what you watch. Until then, stay safe out there.